The fluorescent lights of the empty conference room, presentation still on screen, hummed a low, incessant drone that vibrated in my teeth. It was late, the kind of late where the city outside felt like a distant, indifferent beast. My own reflection, pale and hollow-eyed, stared back from the polished surface of the table. This place, this sterile box of corporate ambition, felt like the antithesis of my life right now. A life teetering on the edge of a precipice, held up only by the frayed threads of hope, and a document that felt more like a curse than a gift. Raj, that's me. And right now I'm drowning in debt, the kind that claws at my throat and steals my sleep. Every rejection letter, every unanswered call, every polite but firm no from a bank, it all coalesced into a suffocating weight. I'd been searching for a way out, a miracle, anything, and then this. A letter, thick cream paper with an embossed crest I didn't recognize, arrived like a phantom. It spoke of a great aunt, a recluse named Alara Vance whom I'd never met. A relative so distant I'd assumed he was a figment of my parents' forgotten family tree, but he was real and he was dead, and he had left me. Everything. The lawyer, a man whose suit seemed too sharp for the hushed quiet of his office, had laid it out with unsettling precision. A mansion, a sprawling, ancient estate nestled deep in the kind of wilderness that swallowed Rhodes whole. And a fortune, a truly staggering sum tied to its inheritance. The catch, I had to live there for 1 year, alone. The word echoed in the cavernous emptiness of the conference room. I traced the condensation ring left by my forgotten coffee cup, the dampness seeping into the wood. It was a strange inheritance, wasn't it? A house I'd never seen, a relative I'd never known, and a condition that felt designed to test my sanity. But the alternative? The alternative was the grim certainty of my current existence. This was a gamble, a desperate leap into the unknown, but the prize was everything I'd ever dreamed of. Financial freedom, a chance to breathe, to finally build something, anything that wasn't crumbling around me. The presentation on the screen flickered, a cascade of sales figures and projected growth. Meaningless. My focus was miles away, lost in the whispered promises of that cryptic will. It spoke of legacy, of protection, of a sanctuary. Sanctuary. There was something in Alara Vance's final words, a veiled warning, a hint of something more than just an old house and money. She'd written in elegant, spidery script that the estate held certain responsibilities. Responsibilities for whom, for what? My phone buzzed, a jarring intrusion. A text from my landlord. Another late notice. I ignored it. What could he do? Evict me? I was about to become the owner of a mansion. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was leaving this life of precariousness for something else, something unknown. The emptiness of the room pressed in, a physical presence. Outside, the city lights blurred, indistinct. I was already halfway there, mentally, a ghost in this corporate purgatory, my gaze fixed on the distant silhouette of a place I couldn't even picture. A place that was now mine. A place that held my future. But as I walked towards the exit, the hum of the lights seemed to deepen, a low thrum that felt less like electricity and more like a pulse. A slow, steady beat emanating from somewhere far beyond these walls, a beat that felt expectant. What was I walking towards? What was waiting for me in that secluded, forgotten place? The hum of the fluorescent lights in the empty conference room, presentation still on screen, was the only sound besides the ragged rhythm of my own breathing. I was still there, staring at my reflection in the polished surface of the table, the words on the screen blurring into meaningless shapes. It was the will. The cryptic, maddening will that had sent me scrambling across the country, that had promised a fortune for simply occupying a house I'd never seen, a house belonging to a great aunt twice removed. I finally pushed myself away from the table, the plastic chair scraping a protest against the linoleum. The city outside was a smear of distant, indifferent lights. My phone buzzed, a lonely chirp in the vast silence of the office, a text from the estate lawyer. Regarding the keys to Blackwood Manor, please confirm your arrival tomorrow. The caretaker will be expecting you. Caretaker, at least that was something, a point of contact, a tether to reality. Blackwood Manor. The name itself felt heavy like damp earth. The drive out was long, the highway giving way to narrower, winding roads choked with overgrown trees. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of pine and something else, something damp and decaying. By the time I saw the wrought iron gates, twisted and rusted like skeletal fingers, the sun had begun its slow descent, bleeding color into the bruised sky. The house loomed. It wasn't just old, it was ancient, a hulking shadow against the twilight. Stone walls, slick with moss, seemed to sweat in the evening air. The caretaker, a stooped man with eyes that flitted nervously, handed me a single heavy key. He mumbled something about the north wing being unsafe, about drafts, before melting back into the deepening gloom. He didn't meet my gaze. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust and neglect. Cobwebs draped the chandeliers like macabre decorations. I explored cautiously, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. Room after room, filled with shrouded furniture like sleeping giants. Heavy velvet curtains, faded and brittle, blocked out what little light remained. The sheer scale of the place was overwhelming, a testament to a forgotten wealth. But beneath the grandeur there was a palpable sense of unease, a feeling of being watched. That first night's sleep was a battlefield. Every creak of the old house, every rustle of wind against the ancient panes seemed amplified. I told myself it was just the settling of an old structure, the symphony of a house that had stood for centuries. I was tired, stressed. My imagination was working overtime, but still I found myself straining my ears, holding my breath, waiting. The next morning, the sunlight, weak as it was, offered a fragile comfort. I decided to explore the north wing, the part the caretaker had warned me about. The door was heavy, groaning on its hinges as I pushed it open. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that pierced the gloom. It was a library, or what had once been one. Bookshelves lined the walls, their contents a chaotic jumble of decaying leather and brittle paper. The air here was heavy, stagnant. As I ran my hand along a shelf, my fingers brushed against something smooth and cool. A small, intricately carved wooden box. No lock, no visible clasp. I turned it over in my hands. A sudden gust of wind, though the windows were firmly shut, slammed the library door shut behind me. The sound was a violent crack, making me jump. My heart gave a lurch, a frantic bird trapped in my chest. I fumbled for the doorknob, my palms suddenly slick with sweat. It wouldn't budge. I pushed, I pulled, but it was as if the door had become part of the wall. "Hello, is anyone there?" Only the echo answered, mocking my fear, and then I saw it. On the floor near the desk, a single child's wooden doll. Its painted eyes seemed to stare directly at me, a faint, unsettling smile fixed on its porcelain face. It hadn't been there a moment ago, I was sure of it. Was I losing my mind, or was this house alive? It had been hours, I think. The faint light filtering through the grimy windows of the warehouse office had shifted, the pale morning glow now a sickly yellow. My phone lay dead on the table, the battery icon a mocking, empty sliver. Every attempt to charge it had failed, the outlets inexplicably inert. Raj's determination, a stubborn ember that had glowed brightly just yesterday, felt like it was being systematically doused. A chill, not of temperature, but of something far more insidious, slithered up my spine. It wasn't just the power. The entire building felt wrong. The air, thick with the scent of stale coffee, and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, seemed to press in on me. I pushed myself away from the table, the scrape of my chair a jarring intrusion into the oppressive silence. The presentation, a detailed breakdown of projected profits for a company I'd never even heard of before the lawyer's call, seemed to mock me. This was supposed to be my inheritance, my escape. Instead, it felt like a trap. I walked to the window, wiping a patch of grime with my sleeve. The sprawling industrial complex was deserted. No vehicles moved on the access roads. No figures bustled in the loading docks below. It was a ghost town, a monument to obsolescence. The will had been so clear. The Lurk estate with all its holdings is to pass to my grandnephew Raj, provided he takes personal possession within 1 month of my passing. Personal possession. I thought it meant living in the mansion, the sprawling, Gothic monstrosity that had appeared on the deed. I hadn't considered the estate, the vast, decaying industrial carcass that surrounded it. The fear had started subtly, faint like static on a bad radio signal just at the edge of hearing. They'd coalesced into words, my name, spoken in a voice that was disturbingly familiar yet utterly alien. It was the voice of doubt, the nagging insecurities I'd spent years trying to bury. "You're not good enough, Raj. You'll fail, just like everyone else." I turned away from the window, my gaze falling on a stack of dusty files on a nearby desk. Curiosity, a dangerous companion in this place, tugged at me. I picked up the top file. It was labeled in elegant, spidery script, Project Nightingale. Inside, the pages were filled with meticulous handwritten notes, sketches, and what looked like early blueprints. The subject matter was vague, hinting at preservation. Of what I couldn't quite decipher. Death for whom? My fingers trembled, the paper crackling. I heard a faint scuttling sound from the corner of the room. I spun around, my breath catching. Nothing, but the feeling persisted, a prickling sensation on my skin as if I were being watched. I backed away from the desk, my eyes scanning the room. The presentation screen flickered, the corporate logos momentarily distorting into grotesque, leering faces. I blinked and they were back to normal, but the image was seared into my mind. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. This wasn't just isolation, this was something else. Something that was actively trying to get inside my head to unravel me. My phone buzzed against the table. A single sharp vibration. My heart leaped. I snatched it up, my fingers fumbling with the power button. The screen remained stubbornly black, dead, but the buzz had been real. I'd felt it. And then another sound. A soft, rhythmic tapping coming from beyond the heavy steel door of the conference room. Tap. It was slow, deliberate, and it was getting louder. I held my breath, straining to hear. Was it Raj? Was it someone else? Or was it the house? The scuttling sound had faded, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the mansion. I told myself it was the house settling, the ancient timbers groaning under their own weight. But a knot of unease tightened in my stomach. The air, thick with the scent of dust and decay, felt heavier now, as if it were pressing down on me. I looked at the will again, the bold, looping script of my unknown benefactor. Immense wealth, a legacy untold. It felt like a cruel joke, a lure into this rotting mausoleum. I walked out of the study, my footsteps echoing unnervingly on the bare floorboards. The hallway stretched before me, a tunnel of deepening twilight. Each portrait lining the walls seemed to watch me, their painted eyes following my progress. I imagined whispers just at the edge of hearing, the rustle of silk, the creak of floorboards not my own. My skin prickled. I needed to get out of this house, to breathe fresh air, to see the sun. But my car keys, I distinctly remembered leaving them on the hall table. I walked towards the grand staircase, my hand reaching for the banister, cool and smooth beneath my fingertips. It felt wrong. The keys weren't there. I retraced my steps, my gaze sweeping across the polished wood. Nothing. My mind raced. Had I put them in my pocket? I fumbled through my trousers, then my jacket. Empty. A tremor ran through me. This was absurd. I was being foolish, letting the house get to me. I decided to tackle the mystery head-on. If this house was going to play games, I'd play along. I returned to the study, the will still spread on the desk. There had to be a clue, something I'd missed. I ran my fingers over the parchment, feeling the raised ink, the subtle watermark. The scuttling returned, fainter this time, but undeniably there. It seemed to emanate from behind the heavy velvet curtains that draped the room's single window. My heart hammered against my ribs. I could feel the blood thrumming in my ears, a frantic, disembodied rhythm. Taking a deep breath, I pulled the curtain back. The glass behind it was grimy, obscuring the world outside. Cobwebs thick as cotton candy clung to the frame. A rat. It scurried away into a crack in the wall, its tiny claws scrabbling against the plaster. Relief, sharp and immediate, washed over me. Just a rat, but the relief was short-lived. As I let the curtain fall, my gaze landed on a small, ornate wooden box tucked away on a high shelf. It hadn't been there before, I was sure of it. My writer's curiosity, a habit I'd cultivated over years of chasing stories, flared. I needed a chair. I dragged a heavy, upholstered armchair across the room, its velvet snagging on the worn rug. Standing on the seat, I reached for the box. It was surprisingly light, intricately carved with swirling patterns that seemed to writhe under my touch. There was no lock, just a small, almost invisible latch. I hesitated. This felt like crossing a threshold. The air around the box seemed to hum with a low, resonant frequency. I could feel it in my teeth, a faint vibration. The scuttling, I realized, had stopped. With trembling fingers, I flicked the latch. The lid sprang open with a soft click. Inside, nestled on faded silk, was a single tarnished silver locket. It was old, its surface dull and scarred. I picked it up. I tried to open it, but it was stuck fast. I pressed harder, my nails digging into the intricate filigree. The curtains billowed violently, as if a phantom presence had just passed through. I gasped, dropping the locket back into the box. It landed with a soft thud. My breath hitched. The box snapped shut, the latch clicking into place as if by its own volition. Light vanished. The wind died down, leaving the room in its suffocating stillness. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely keep them steady. I stumbled off the chair, my legs feeling like lead. I needed to leave, now. I reached the grand staircase, my gaze falling on the hall table again, and there, glinting innocently, were my car keys. They hadn't been there before. I knew they hadn't. I snatched them up, my fingers brushing against the cool metal. They felt solid, real, a lifeline. I didn't stop to question it. I bolted for the front door, the heavy oak groaning as I wrenched it open. The outside world greeted me with a gray, overcast sky, but it was the most beautiful sight I had ever seen. I practically ran to my car, fumbling with the lock. As I slid into the driver's seat, the engine roaring to life, I glanced back at the mansion. One of the upper windows, a small, dormer window I hadn't noticed before, seemed to watch. And for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a flicker of that sickly green light. I slammed the car into reverse, tires spitting gravel. I had to get away. I paced the length of the empty conference room, presentation still on screen. The sterile white walls, a stark contrast to the decaying grandeur of the rest of the mansion, offered no comfort. They just amplified the hollowness, the echoing silence that pressed in on me. Raj. My name felt foreign, a small anchor in a sea of disquiet. This place, this inheritance, it was meant to be a new beginning. Instead, it was a tightening noose. The scuttling. It had been so distinct, so close, not rats. I knew the sound of rats. This was different. A dry, chitinous rasp, like fingernails on a chalkboard, but deeper, more resonant. It had come from behind the wall in the study, the one with the peeling damask wallpaper. I'd pressed my ear against it, my breath catching, but only the house's usual symphony of groans and sighs answered. The presentation on the screen, a relic of some forgotten corporate retreat, flickered. A pie chart, once vibrant, now muted by the dim light filtering through the grimy window, seemed to mock my predicament. Business plans, growth strategies, market analysis, all utterly meaningless here. What was the market for fear? What was the growth strategy of a house that seemed determined to suffocate me? I stopped, my gaze fixed on the screen. The presenter, a man with a slick-back hairstyle and an unnervingly wide smile, gestured enthusiastically. His words were lost to me, but the image remained, a frozen tableau of forced optimism. It felt like a deliberate taunt. This house, it played with me. It fed me illusions, the promise of wealth, the cryptic will it was all a lure. The air in the conference room grew colder. I could see my breath misting in front of me, a ghostly plume in the artificial light. The scent of dust was stronger here, laced with something else. Something metallic like old blood and a cloying sweetness like overripe fruit left to rot. It made my stomach churn. I'd spent the last few days trying to rationalize it all. The flickering lights were faulty wiring, the feeling of being watched, my own paranoia. But the scuttling, that was harder to dismiss. My fingers traced the condensation on the window pane. Outside, the trees clawed at the sky, their branches skeletal against the bruised twilight. The grounds were overgrown, a tangled wilderness that seemed to press in on the mansion, suffocating it. I hadn't seen another soul since I arrived. No deliveries, no maintenance crews, no curious locals, just me and the house. I turned back to the room. The projector hummed, a low, persistent drone. It was the only sound, save for my own ragged breathing. I walked towards the screen, drawn by an unseen force. The presenter's smile seemed to widen his eyes, two vacant dots fixed on me. The presenter on the screen didn't answer, of course. But then a faint rustling. Not from the wall this time, from the screen itself. The image wavered, the pie chart dissolving into a swirling pattern of dust motes. The slick-haired man's face contorted, his smile stretching into a rictus of pure agony. Not a metaphor. A physical, painful thudding. I could feel it in my throat, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I stumbled backward, my heel catching on the edge of a discarded water bottle. I fell, the impact jarring my teeth. The screen went black. Then a low, guttural sound. It wasn't human. It was a sigh, a weary exhalation, but it vibrated through the floorboards, through my very bones. It was a sound of immense age, of profound hunger. It filled the room, then the entire mansion. It wasn't just the house groaning anymore. It was something in the house, something that had been waiting. I scrambled to my feet, my eyes darting around the room. The walls seemed to lean in, the ceiling lowering. The air was thick, suffocating. The metallic tang was stronger now, almost overwhelming. I could taste it on my tongue, coppery and foul. The scuttling sound returned. This time it wasn't from the study. It was closer, much closer. It was coming from behind the screen. A slow, deliberate scraping, as if something was dragging itself across the floor just out of sight. My breath hitched. I could feel the vibrations through the soles of my shoes. This wasn't just a house. It was alive, and it was hungry. What did it want with me? The stark white of the empty conference room, presentation still on screen, felt like a wound. It was a space I'd carved out, a desperate attempt to impose order on this sprawling, rotting entity. I dragged a projector in, set up a makeshift office, a place where the dust motes didn't dance quite so menacingly in the slivers of light. Now, the bright, sterile glow of the screen mocked me. It showed projections of market trends, growth charts, the kind of data that felt utterly irrelevant in the face of the creeping rot that was consuming my life. I tapped a finger against the cool glass of the projector. The hum it emitted was a thin, reedy sound, easily swallowed by the vast silence of the mansion. Outside, the wind had picked up, a mournful keening that snaked through the ancient eaves. It sounded like voices sometimes, whispers I couldn't quite decipher, always just beyond the edge of hearing. My resolve had solidified over the past few days. This house, this thing, was playing games with me. It was feeding on my isolation, on the gnawing fear that had taken root the moment I'd first stepped through the grand, creaking doors. The will, the promise of wealth, it was all a lure. A trap. And I was caught. I needed to break free. Not just from the physical confines, though that was paramount. I needed to break free from its influence, from the way it twisted my thoughts, dredging up old anxieties and magnifying them into monstrous shapes. The way the air had grown heavy, thick with a scent like damp earth and something metallic, something like old pennies. I walked over to the heavy oak door of the conference room. It was always locked, a precaution I'd insisted on, a small bastion of control. It turned with a familiar grating squeal. Freedom. The hallway beyond was dim, the once-grand wallpaper peeling in long, curling strips, revealing patches of bare plaster that looked like bruised skin. The air here was cooler, carrying the faint, cloying sweetness of decay. My plan was simple, almost foolishly so. I would walk out the front door, get into my car, and drive. I wouldn't look back. I would just go. The grand staircase loomed at the end of the hall, its polished banister gleaming dully in the gloom. I'd avoided it mostly, sticking to the service corridors and smaller rooms, but the quickest route to the main entrance led that way. As I approached, a faint scent wafted down from the upper floors. Lilac. It was a perfume I hadn't smelled in years, not since my grandmother wore it. A memory, sharp and unexpected, pricked at me. My grandmother, her kind eyes, her gentle hands. She'd always smelled of lilacs. The house knew. It knew what small comforts I clung to, what fragments of a life before this place I still held dear, and it was using them. I quickened my pace, my footsteps echoing unnervingly loud on the marble floor. I placed my foot on the first step. The wood groaned under my weight, a sound like a stifled cry. I took another step, then another. The house seemed to hold its breath. Halfway up, I stopped. A sound, a soft, rhythmic thudding, coming from the landing above. It wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too steady. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Don't listen, I told myself. Just keep going. I forced myself to ascend. The thudding grew louder, more distinct. It was the sound of something heavy being dragged, slowly, painfully. On the landing, the light was even more scarce. The lilac scent was overpowering now, a sickly sweet shroud. And the thudding, it was coming from the master bedroom. The room I'd deliberately avoided, the room the caretaker's dusty journal had warned me about in its cryptic, fragmented entries. I crept forward, my movements stiff, my muscles coiled tight. The thudding stopped. I pushed the door open, a few inches at first. The room was vast, draped in heavy, moth-eaten velvet curtains. Dust motes danced in the single beam of moonlight that pierced the gloom. In the center of the room, I saw it. A rocking. And it was rocking, gently, rhythmically, back and forth, as if someone had just risen from it. But there was no one there. The lilac scent was strongest here, emanating from a small, tarnished silver locket lying on the dusty floor beside the rocking chair. I recognized it. It was my grandmother's, the one she always wore. How my breath hitched. My hands clenched into fists, nails digging into my palms. This wasn't just manipulation. This was personal. The rocking chair continued its steady rhythm, a silent, implacable metronome marking the passage of my sanity. I wanted to scream, to run, to smash the chair, the locket, the entire room to dust. But my feet were rooted to the spot, my gaze locked on the empty seat. What was it trying to show me? What did it want me to feel? It wasn't the house settling. It was a voice, my grandmother's voice. Raj. It crooned, soft and laced with an unbearable sorrow. Don't leave me. My blood turned to ice. The air grew thick, suffocating. I stumbled back, my hand instinctively reaching for the doorframe for escape. Was it her? Or was it the house wearing her voice like a mask? And if it was the house, what else did it know? What other faces could it wear? What other memories could it twist to keep me here, trapped in its decaying embrace? The silence that followed was a physical weight. It pressed against my eardrums, a low hum that vibrated in my bones. My breath hitched in my throat, a dry rasp. The rocking chair continued its phantom sway, the faint squeak a needle against my frayed nerves. It wasn't possible, it couldn't be. Yet the echo of that whisper, so achingly familiar, clung to the stagnant air. Was it a trick of the wind? A rodent scurrying in the walls? I forced my gaze away from the chair, from the locket glinting dully in the gloom. They weren't just absences of light. They were hungry. I could feel them watching, waiting. My muscles tensed, ready to bolt, but my feet were rooted to the spot. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of this cursed room, this cursed house. But a stubborn resolve, born of desperation and a flicker of defiance, kept me tethered. I wouldn't be driven out, not yet. The house wanted me to fear. It fed on it. This was more than just a feeling. This was a direct assault. The voice. Her voice. It had been so clear, so intimate. It had to be a hallucination, a product of my own fracturing sanity. But the locket was real. I had touched it. My hand trembled as I reached out again, my fingers brushing against the cool, smooth metal. It was heavy, substantial. A tangible piece of the past, of her past. The intricate carvings felt alien beneath my fingertips, yet oddly familiar, like a forgotten dream. The house was trying to lure me in, to trap me with its illusions, but I wouldn't fall for it. I had to push back. I needed to understand. The will, the wealth, the secrecy, it all felt like a carefully orchestrated trap. The distant relative I never knew. Why leave everything to me, unless I was meant to be the next occupant? The thought sent a fresh wave of nausea through me. I backed away from the rocking chair, my eyes scanning the room. The oppressive silence was broken only by the frantic thumping of my own heart, a rhythm that felt too loud, too exposed. The dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the grimy windows, each one a tiny, mocking specter. I walked towards the heavy oak door, my hand reaching for the ornate brass knob. I twisted it, but it wouldn't budge, locked, of course. I rattled the knob, then slammed my shoulder against the wood. It was like hitting solid stone. No amount of force would open it. I was trapped. Again, the walls seemed to lean in, the ceiling to lower. I could hear a faint scratching sound, like claws on wood, coming from the other side of the door. My breath came in ragged gasps. I turned, my back pressed against the unyielding wood, and faced the room. The rocking chair was still. The locket lay undisturbed. But the air was different. It was charged, expectant. A faint scent, something cloying and sweet, like decaying flowers, began to fill my nostrils. It was nauseating, suffocating. Then a sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It wasn't coming from the door anymore. It was coming from within the room. I spun around, my eyes darting, searching for the source. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Tap. It was coming from the wall behind the rocking chair. I cautiously approached, my heart a jackhammer against my ribs. The wallpaper, peeling and faded, seemed to bulge slightly in one spot. My fingers, slick with sweat, traced the outline of the bulge. It felt warm, impossibly warm, and beneath the warmth, a faint vibration. The tapping stopped. I held my breath, listening. A low groan emanated from the wall, not the creak of old wood, but something deeper, more organic. The bulge intensified, pushing outward. It stared at me, unblinking, unmoving. And then it spoke. I thought I could escape me. The words weren't spoken aloud. They echoed inside my skull, a violation of my own thoughts. My knees buckled and I sank to the floor, the decaying floral scent overwhelming. I squeezed my eyes shut, but the image of that eye was burned behind my eyelids. The house wasn't just preying on my fears. It was a living, breathing entity, a predator that had finally revealed its true face. And I was its prey. Where did this eye lead? Was it a window into a deeper, more monstrous heart of the mansion, or a mere illusion designed to break me? The echo faded, leaving behind a ringing silence that pressed against my eardrums. The image of the eye, ancient and knowing, remained. It wasn't just in my head. It was of my head. That was the twist. The will, the inheritance, the isolation, it was all a carefully constructed stage, and I was the unwilling performer. The entity didn't just feed on fear, it manufactured it, weaving it from the threads of my own mind. My own mind. A chilling thought. I pushed myself up, my limbs stiff and clumsy. I needed to get out. Now, but the way I came in was no longer the way out. The grand foyer, once a symbol of my potential wealth, now felt like the maw of a beast. The heavy oak doors remained stubbornly shut, their iron hinges groaning a protest with every shift of the house's unseen weight. I'd tried them, of course, hours ago, in a panic that now seemed laughably naive. They were sealed, not locked, but sealed, as if the wood itself had swollen to become one with the stone frame. My gaze swept across the room, landing on the door I'd entered just before the revelation. It led, I remembered, to a wing I'd mostly avoided. A flicker of hope, thin as a candle flame in a gale, ignited. Perhaps a service entrance. A forgotten window, anything. The hallway was narrow, the wallpaper peeling like sunburnt. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the grime-caked windows. I imagined unseen eyes tracking my progress, a silent audience to my desperate flight. I reached the end of the corridor, a single unmarked door. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the tarnished brass knob. This was it, the last gamble. Taking a deep, ragged breath, I turned it. The latch clicked, a sound of finality. It opened into a vast, cavernous space. An empty conference room, presentation still on screen. The projector hummed, casting a ghostly blue light onto the faded slides. Charts and graphs, rendered meaningless by the context of my current reality, flickered in the gloom. It was a relic of a different time, a world that felt impossibly distant. My world. The screen displayed a projection of what looked like a financial forecast. Numbers, projections, a world of logic and order. It was jarring, an affront to the organic, insidious horror that had consumed this place. But as I stared, a detail snagged my attention. A recurring symbol subtly embedded in the footer of each slide. A stylized knot. I'd seen it before, etched into the banister of the main staircase, carved into the wooden frame of the portrait in the study. It was the same symbol that had been drawn in the dust on my bedside table. My blood, which had been a sluggish current, now surged. This wasn't just a forgotten office. It was a focal point. A nexus, the entity had left its mark. My eyes traced the lines of the knot on the screen. It was intricate, complex, a trap or a key. I remembered the sensation of the entity's presence, the way it had coiled around my thoughts. This knot, it felt similar, a pattern, a structure. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with an unseen pressure. The hum of the projector seemed to deepen, becoming a low thrum that vibrated in my bones. I could feel it now, the entity's attention, sharp and focused not just on me, but on this room, this screen, this symbol. It was a challenge. I looked at the projected knot again. It was a puzzle. And I, Raj, the inheritor, the victim, was now the one who had to solve it. But what were the pieces? What was the solution? The room began to spin, the charts on the screen blurring into a chaotic swirl of color. What move could I possibly make when the game itself was being played inside my own head? The air in the empty conference room, presentation still on screen, tasted of stale coffee and forgotten ambition. Fluorescent lights hummed a dull, insistent tune, a stark contrast to the suffocating quiet of the manor. I stood before the projected slides, a tableau of my own unraveling. They were there, the diagrams, the frantic scrawls, the impossible equations that had once seemed like the ramblings of a madman. Now they were the language of my undoing. The eye, that infernal, knowing eye, it had been the key, hadn't it? Not a vision, not a hallucination, but a connection. A parasitic tendril reaching from the very marrow of Blackwood Manor into the soft, yielding tissue of my own consciousness. The will, the fortune, it was all a lure, a meticulously baited hook. The true inheritance wasn't wealth, it was this intimate, horrifying symbiosis. My fingers traced the cool, smooth surface of the projector. The image flickered, a ghost of the eye still imprinted on my retina. I remembered the moment it had bloomed, not in the dusty library of the manor, but here in this sterile, impersonal space amidst the drone of a quarterly review. The room had been full then, faces turned expectantly towards the screen, their hushed murmurs a comforting backdrop. And then the shift. A subtle tremor, a prickling sensation behind my eyes. It had started small. A fleeting shadow in my peripheral vision. A whisper that sounded like my own name just out of earshot. Then the house began to respond. Doors would creak open as I approached, as if anticipating my arrival. The scent of damp earth, so pervasive within the manor walls, would suddenly fill my nostrils, even here miles away. Raj, they called me. A fool. I'd come seeking a fortune, a grand escape from a life that felt too small, too predictable. Instead, I'd found a cage built not of stone and mortar, but of fear and delusion. The manor wasn't just a house, it was a consciousness, ancient and hungry, and it had chosen me. It had woven itself into my very being, its desires becoming my own, its anxieties my own. The presentation on the screen detailed market projections, mundane figures meaningless now. I saw it, though, in the stark white of the slides, the patterns. The way the lines curved, the subtle shifts in color. They weren't just data points. They were a map of the manor's vast, interconnected network. They were instructions, they were extensions. My breath hitched. I felt it then, a faint thrumming beneath my ribs, a resonance that mirrored the low hum of the projector. The manor was still there, still connected, still waiting. It had taken everything from me, my peace, my sanity, my very sense of self. But it hadn't taken my will, not entirely. I'd left the manor. I'd sought out the familiar, the rational, this empty conference room. This stark reminder of the world I'd tried to escape felt like a sanctuary. A place where numbers meant numbers and presentations were just that, but the eye. It was still there behind my closed lids. They spoke of unfinished business, of a debt owed, the manor's debt, my debt. I remembered the last day. The air had grown thick, heavy with an unspoken promise. The very walls had seemed to sigh, a sound of weary resignation or perhaps satisfaction. I had walked out, not free but changed. A part of me remained tethered to that place, a root that had burrowed deep into my soul. The screen flickered again, the bright light momentarily blinding. My hands trembled, not with fear, but with a strange, nascent power. The manor had tried to consume me, to erase me, but in doing so it had also made me a part of itself. I was no longer just Raj, the inheritor. I was also something else, something that understood its rhythms, its hungers. A faint scent, almost imperceptible, wafted through the air, damp earth and something else, something metallic like old blood. It wasn't coming from the projector, it was coming from me. The empty conference room, presentation still on screen, was no longer a sanctuary. It was just another room, and the true emptiness, the true horror, was the space that had been carved out within me. Was I free? Or had I merely brought the manor with me, a silent passenger in the landscape of my own mind? The silence stretched, broken only by the dull hum of the lights, and the echo of a question I was no longer sure I wanted answered.